Another night, another winging it, and
Yes.
tonight is I'm quite thrilled. We're going to be talking to John Hartman, who I don't know exactly where he lives, but he lives, small town.
North of here.
Yeah, somewhere near Georgian Bay, and he's been painting the kind of Georgian Bay and kind of the landscape, right? He's been painting landscape for probably 25, 30 years.
And cities and
And
cityscapes.
cities, yes. Well, so John's work is gone from. So I was just looking at this. So I've got this from the prints from
The
mid 80s,
exhibition.
early 90s, and they were like really, really
Gestural,
minimal,
expressionistic.
like almost like stick figures, expressionist.
Yeah.
And then, the stuff that's at McMichael right now is, very elaborately painted. So really want to talk to him about it because it looks like there's been this trajectory from, being kind of loose, abstracty. Looks like he absorbed some of the stuff from the 80s. Some of the paintings that I really loved early
Yes.
on were very loose and abstract compared
Yes.
to the stuff
The
that
neo-expressionists of the 80s.
neo-expressionistic, yes, exactly, and very colorful. Hey,
Yes.
hello there. Oh,
Hello.
Hi, Charles. Hi, Mark.
hi
Hi,
there.
John.
Welcome to Winging It.
Yes, welcome.
What's in the background of your?
This is just a like a photo room divider. It's the house I lived at previous to this. My son had his bedroom beside the TV room, and this sort of was the wall.
Okay, I got you.
Yeah.
And I'm sitting in my son's room because we're very close to the router. The way my house's wiring has been configured, this is how I have to get close to the router. If I were in my studio area, that would be in the basement, and it's too far from the router to ensure, a good internet connection at this point. So
We keep losing.
that's why there are dinosaurs up there, and
Okay.
some lovely graphic novels,
Yeah.
courtesy of Marvel and others behind me.
And you look like you're in your studio.
I am.
Yeah, right on. Well, we really appreciate you joining us. I know
Yes.
it's probably been a busy time with your show up at McMichael, and I did watch the interview you did with Sarah Milroy and all the various other bits, reading poems and stuff of the writers. And so Mark and I were just talking before you came on. I mean, a lot of that stuff about the writers and the literary stuff has been covered. We don't need to retread or go back over that. Mark and I are both artists, painters, and so our interest is in the painting, the techniques, the nuts and bolts of painting. And I've been following your work since the early 90s. I'll show you. I got a whole bunch of catalogs.
Oh, yes.
First one was the Painting the Bay.
Yes.
Yes.
Which I absolutely, I missed that show, but I bought the catalog and I really devoured it. I was a huge fan of kind of that loose neo-expressionistic painting that incorporated figures and landscape. And it was candy for the eyes or whatever. So luscious.
Yeah, that was really the first big or major exhibition of those big paintings done that way. There'd been one in a show at Miracle-Darden. There'd been a show at 49th Parallel in New York, and I can't remember the exact order of things, but I think the Mira and the 49th Parallel came first, and then the Painting the Bay one came after.
Right.
So what
And
got you painting not just large scale paintings, but in that style, in that very loose expressionistic, almost abstract style at that time? Because that was kind of unique, for, especially in Canada.
Yeah, it was. There, you know, when I left art school, really to be taken seriously as a painter, you had to paint post-painterly abstraction.
right,
Had to
right. Yeah,
paint
you
something
were.
from like
Yeah,
Jack
you're
Bush.
10 years older than me, and you must have been like that late modernism, the early '70s.
Yes, it was, and it was very prescribed. You know, there were
Yeah,
certain things that were kind of acceptable, and there were other things that were just considered unacceptable. And
Hmm.
it didn't really work for me to paint that way. And I'd also been trained at McMaster in the
Hmm.
fine art department, which was a kind of European, British
right.
uh, kind of teaching with an emphasis on German expressionism, strangely
Okay.
enough.
Yeah, that
Oh,
comes through the
Uh,
work. Yeah.
so, so that was my background. And then when I went out on my own, I wanted to, you know, I basically wanted to be a landscape painter. I wanted to paint the
Okay.
landscape I grew up in, which was Georgian Bay, and that was considered pretty old-fashioned
Right.
ambition.
Right. Right.
hmm.
But I began to realize in about maybe 5 or 6 years after I graduated that I was also really, every time I sat down in a landscape, I was aware of the history of the place.
Right. Right.
It's like it's older history. In my current experiences in it and other people's experiences in a place. And so I was looking at a landscape painting just the rocks, trees, and sky, but I was aware of all these stories.
Right.
And
Right.
I
Yes.
just thought maybe I could combine the two somehow. And I didn't, so in the very beginning, they were tiny little wee figures in a kind of
Yes.
a
Oh,
simplified
yes, yes.
post-painterly abstract landscape.
Right. Right. Right.
And then as I got feeling more confident about it, the figurative element got bigger, and it sort of took over the paintings for a while in the late 80s. And then
Yes.
in
Yes.
the 90s, early 90s, very late 80s and early 90s, there was more of a balance emerged between the figurative element and the landscape element. And that's when the work that you were talking about happened.
I'm going to pull that up. This one, really, I love this one. Is it Gilbert de Rocher or Gilbert?
Yes.
Gilbert.
Yeah. Well, he was called, you know, the proper pronunciation of his name was Gilbert, but a lot of his family called him Gilbert.
Gilbert.
So.
Yeah. That painting is I mean, I can look at that for hours. I love the way the figure, like, it's like it's emerging out of the, well, it's like the, I used to be really interested in the early paintings of David Hockney, where the
Mhm.
figures and the ground were kind of, there's a push and pull. And this
Yes.
sort of has that same kind of dynamic of it. The landscape's there, the figure is kind of emerging out of it and rising up.
Well, one of the problems in floating figures in front of a landscape, which is an aerial view, is how do you make it make sense? So in
Right.
some ways, you can't paint the landscape super realistically, or to do that, you have to paint the figure super realistically. So
Right.
one of the things I did was I made, the skies are always way too dark for a traditional landscape, but that sort of makes the whole place like a, like, it flattens the landscape out. It stops the recession off to the distance and lets you stop with the figurative elements. But it's interesting you mentioned Hockney, because, you know, if I had to look around when I was starting off as an artist and look for other, like, look for prominent artists who might be models for what I would wanted to do, Hockney was certainly one of them.
Sure.
In Canada, there was Patterson Ewan.
Right. Right.
But there weren't a lot of, well, there were a fair number of people working in the way I was interested in, but I didn't know they existed because they weren't being, they didn't have exhibitions where I was going, and they weren't covered in the art magazines.
Right.
As time went on, I became more and more aware of other people who were trying similar things.
Were you aware of like all the German and Italian painters in the 80s,
Yes, because Roland Asgard did a big show at the AGO called the European Iceberg.
Yes,
So
yes,
that introduced
yeah.
the German and Italian neo-expressionists. But Glenn Cumming, when he was curator in Hamilton, at the Archive of Hamilton, did a show before that called German Realism, which wasn't German realism at all. It was not in the sense that we thought of realism at the time. It was simply any German painter painting anything that was a recognizable subject matter.
Right.
From fairly high realism right to almost complete abstraction. So it had Baselitz, it had Immendorf, it had all of,
Right, all the,
and it had a lot of lesser known people as well. And the thing you realize was in Germany, this tradition, it wasn't like the iceberg Nasgard was describing. It had just been an ongoing tradition that hadn't stopped since the 20s.
Right, didn't suddenly appear in the 80s.
No.
Yeah, there was no neo in
No.
neo-expressionism. It was just German expressionism, the latest generation.
Right, I mean, Baselitz was doing that stuff from 50s, 60s, 70s.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
And he just all of a sudden started turning them all upside down.
Right. You got that a bit of a gimmick there.
And I was also at that point in the early 90s spending time in Denmark and hanging around with what would be the Danish equivalent of neo-expressionist painters, but they were all a younger generation. I mean, younger than Baselitz, Immendorf. They were my age. They were in their late 30s, early 40s at the time.
Right.
So I had a lot of exposure to those painters and exhibited with them and was, I think, influenced by 2 or 3 of them especially.
Right. Just trying to, like, I'm thinking about the trajectory of your work, like that stuff from the early 90s. It's loose, it's neo-expressionistic a bit. It's, the colors are psychedelic almost, like really turned up. And then when you look at the show now at like Michael, there's still some of that elements like that, but it's a little bit more, it's just more refined. I don't know if that's the right word.
Well, it's formalized, maybe a little bit more formalistic. Still touches and snatches of the bursts of color here and there, but very clearly recognizable landscape
and recognizable people. And I think the reason is that in deciding that I wanted to paint portraits of these authors, they were public figures who were recognizable.
Right.
Because their photographs appear on the dust jackets of all their books. So I kind of felt obliged to, I didn't want to be addressing the concern from the audience. This doesn't look like David Adams Richards. Doesn't even look remotely like David Adams Richards. Who the hell do you think you are? And there had been some portrait work I'd done before these ones that sort of led me there.
You were doing stuff like that in the, I don't know, 10 years ago.
Yes,
I noticed those kinds of portrait type figures appearing in your landscapes.
Yes,
again, hovering above or behind the landscapes.
Yes, and so having decided that I wanted to paint them realistically enough that they'd be recognizable, then the landscape components sort of had to work
with that.
It had to be painted in the same way, I felt anyway. So it led to, I would just describe it as, they're just more realistic paintings. They look more like what the photographs that I took of the authors in order to make the paintings look like. and they look like the photographic source, more like the photographic sources that I use for the landscape. So in some cases, the studies for the landscape, the little watercolors were done on location, but in other cases they're aerial shots where I was using a drone.
Okay,
So,
yeah.
or I rented an airplane and flown over an area. So
I'm glad you mentioned that. I was going to ask you, how are you getting these aerial views, which you've done through most of your oeuvre?
Yes.
Are you taking photos from airplanes and helicopters, or now you have drones, I guess, to assist you? Is that
both? Before the drone, helicopters and airplanes. Then now both, because the drone has a height limitation of 400 feet.
Yeah.
Okay.
But before that, I just I just kept sketching an area long enough from the ground, from as many viewpoints as possible, that finally at some point, the information just all coalesced into a whole. And I could say, okay, now if I'm above Halifax on the Dartmouth side of the McDonald Bridge and I'm looking across it, this is sort of what I'd see. And it was all very related to the experience I'd had. So I'd spent most of my time on sketching Halifax on the waterfront. So it's all, everything is waterfront related. The whole interior of the main area of Halifax gets compressed and kind of left out because I didn't spend much time there sketching.
Right.
So, but after either being in an area that I was really familiar with, or after having sketched a new city for a long time, I would get the kind of, would be like, I would have a map that would emerge in my mind of the place. And I could posit these different viewpoints and then construct a view just based on this kind of accumulated set of knowledge.
Wow. So it's an imagined, or like almost like a projected, or a bird's eye view. It's like you're imagining being up there.
Yes.
That's amazing.
And a very convincing view. I mean, the perspective is remarkable. Like your handling of perspective is remarkable, given that you weren't necessarily actually working from a photo in a lot of cases.
Yeah, and you know, I've always felt I'm kind of notorious for disregarding perspective. Like,
it's so convincing. I mean,
well, that's great. Because it is for me, but I never know how it, I mean, the real test with those pieces is for somebody that lives there, but inevitably what happens is somebody will say to me, oh, that's my aunt's house. And they point to a glob of paint, literally, with a glob of paint, and say, that's where my aunt lives. I used to visit her every summer. We went there in July. And I'm thinking, so they've done the same thing I've done. They've taken their accumulated knowledge.
You were Google mapping the cityscapes and landscapes of North America long before Google existed.
Yeah, well, I actually had subscribed to the program before it was Google.
Okay,
it was I can't remember what it was called. It was something else entirely, and I think it was used.
Right. We would all have access to. You would have had access to that through that kind of Google Earth, Google Map. GPS systems.
Yeah, I was fascinated when it came along because it was it was an aid to me. But the truth is, I think some of the most interesting aerial view landscapes I've done have been the ones where I had no way of getting up there at all.
No,
that I just had to learn it all from the ground. Like London, England, for example, you can't fly an airplane or a helicopter over London. You simply can't get permission.
Oh, interesting.
And so everything I've done of London has either been based on getting up in the that big Ferris wheel that goes around.
Oh, yeah.
Waterloo Bridge,
Yes.
or the Gherkin, that big office tower built in the city district.
Interesting, yeah.
So I got those two views, and then I had to fill everything else in just by walking along the Thames and sketching it. And then eventually you figure out where every bridge is.
So your brain is just sort of like creating the composite.
Yes.
Of all those parts. I was going to ask you, are you familiar with this? There's a artist, a British artist, a young man who has autism. He flies around cities, then he goes back and he draws the whole city from memory.
Yeah, I know of him, and
Yeah.
it's quite unbelievable.
Isn't it?
But
eh?
what he's got is he's got a skill set, like he's accumulating in one helicopter ride
Yes, yeah.
what takes me months and months and months, and I don't end up with the amount of detail that he has in his
Sure.
mind. Like he can reproduce what every building looks like from the air,
It's
sort of how many floors it has.
It's beyond normal human perception.
Well, the curious thing is that were we all to ride in a helicopter with him, our eyes would see the same thing he's seen, but our brains wouldn't.
Wouldn't be able to capture all the.
So we're just discarding information like crazy because our brain says we don't need it.
Right.
Whereas his is somehow wired differently, so
Exactly.
he's not. He probably couldn't tell you a lot of things about.
He doesn't have the filters. Yeah, he doesn't have the filters
but he remembers all of that.
Yeah.
And in some ways, I just had to kind of train my brain to kind of get a little wee bit close to what he was capable of.
Yeah. It's not really expected. Yeah. So I've seen the city's paintings at Nicholas, is it Metivier? Is that how you say the gallery?
Yes.
Yeah, seen some of those. Amazing, right? Just and the interesting thing is this show with the writers seems to integrate everything you know over your career with interest in people, stories, place,
Yes,
aerial view,
Escape, city, people, history, all gathered into a narrative, streaming together into a single narrative on canvas.
yeah, and the ones that really interested me were the portraits where I felt I had the kind of license to introduce narrative components into the landscape part. So in the visual space between the author and the landscape, that I could float these.
One of my favorite paintings is Thomas King, where he's standing on the land, the land is behind him, and then you've got a few of those narrative, I think it's like there's two figures, there's a hand, and that's so beautiful because you're taking some of that older painting. Go ahead.
Well, yeah. So in that case, I was working on his, like looking at the studies I'd made of Chesterman Beach, which is what he wanted in his portrait.
Yes, yeah.
And I was listening to his lectures on the Massey lectures, where he introduced each lecture with the same indigenous creation stories.
Right.
And those are the two indigenous creation stories he talks about. But when I got it all drawn in on the canvas, so my working process is to literally draw the whole thing in red paint. So it's all completely composed. And when I got to that stage, I thought, ooh, I better check in with Thomas here. Because I didn't know if I was, there are two things I wanted to avoid. One was I wanted to avoid my paintings being illustrations of something they'd written. And the other thing I wanted to avoid was somehow picking up on something in their writing that they didn't think was something they wanted emphasized. So I took a quick photograph of it and sent it to him in an email and explained what all the references were in the painting. And he basically wrote me back and said, I don't think it's my opinion to tell you how to make your painting, so go for it. And
did you consult with did you consult with all the authors this way, or just
no? That was the only case where I did it. What I did when
you know all of the authors in the show. No.
Well, I mean, I've met them all, but I didn't know them personally as friends beforehand.
Okay.
But I met them all for a photo session where I photographed them for about 45 minutes and then talked to them for about another hour and a half, sometimes much longer, about the place that they wanted in their paintings. And then I went to that place, most often without them, and began sketching and collecting information, and then let it all sit for a period of time, and then tried to figure out what it was about that place that really was important to them, and then how can I get that into the painting somehow. And like sometimes it was, these were just sort of technical things. If the really relevant information about the place was in the foreground, I had to do like more of a standing figure or a waist up figure, so it was narrower, and I had space out here to put those things in. So then I'd have to go back and look at the photos and say, okay, like, do I have a waist up shot of Susan Swan so that I can get the Midland Library in here and something else in there? And if I didn't, I had to go back and take more photos, or try to combine, one photo with another. And so it was a kind of slow process to figure out the compositions.
It sounds almost journalistic in a way.
Well,
reviewing the writers and the photography and checking out and surveying the locations to the extent, a lot of research.
Yes, there was, and it was, and then the painting process was different for me because I kind of had to paint the background first before I painted the portrait. And how you can't, really, if you paint something that's behind something and you paint it over top of it, it looks, where the two meet, it looks weird.
Yeah.
It looks like the background
no, it's
jumped into the foreground. So even the way that I had to work on the background part, and then I could work on that part of the head. And so it was I ended up with a pretty tight working method that didn't really allow for a lot of throwing paint around.
I wanted to ask you about the challenge of getting likenesses. I've got 8 years of figure studying. I can draw a figure with my eyes closed practically. But sometimes to get the likeness of someone is really, really freaking hard. You can observe every part. Somehow you put it together, and the eyes just don't match up. And it was a challenge.
So what I would do is I'd look for the one photo that really seemed to catch something about their personality and their nature. And then I'd start off and I would draw the figure onto the canvas first with red paint, like just a line drawing. And I kept monkeying around with that until it seemed to be, I seemed to have got the likeness thing happening. And then I would just stop that part. I would put the landscape part in as I'd figured it out. And the exact same thing happened when I was painting. The moment I got what I felt like where it felt like the person, I didn't monkey around with it or change it. But then I felt obliged to send an image of the final painting to everybody and say, are you okay with this? And that led to some people thinking the paintings were marvelous, and other people.
It's always going to be the way, right?
Others were saying, well, it's your interpretation, John, that's fine. I'm good with that.
Well, some people, I would say everybody felt that everybody was, the way Neil Bissendath described it, that they found it not strange, but unsettling.
Yes, I just read that today. It was like the appealing but unsettling, or So I think everybody felt it was unsettling, and then there were just these different ranges of reaction to feeling unsettled. Some people, like Neil, thought it was great. He thought it was unsettling in the best kind of way, and other people were unsettled in they felt a little bit unflattering, maybe. I mean, the paintings range
disturbed
from.
me.
I mean,
they are unflattering because I paint everything in a very full light with
Sure. Yeah.
the light almost always behind or at the side.
Mhm.
Everything is illuminated in that kind of stark northern sideways coming light that picks out every detail.
Yeah.
And
Yes.
so this was where the landscapes influenced the portraits, because I've always painted the landscapes that way. I
don't
felt like
think-
I have to paint the portraits in the same light. It just
Exactly.
never occurred to me to paint them any other way. But everybody is kind of illuminated with this really bright light on them,
Sure.
which leaves no room for hiding.
Well, the
You're
painting
not
of
gonna
George
see too many
Bowering is,
flattering portraits in an Otto Dix painting or in a Kokoschka painting.
Well, yeah, so there's that stream of German painting in the 20s and 30s. I forget what it was called, what the word for it was, but it was kind of a hyper-realist, but also expressionist.
yes, right, a little exaggerated.
Yes, and that's sort of, I think, where this, I don't paint exactly like
No, I wouldn't.
those painters, but I think it falls into the same sense
kind
of light.
sensibility. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's not quite as unflattering as, say, a Lucien Freud that can,
Right.
warts and all. The painting of George Bowering is a good example. Like, it's so, this is just, and because his head is large on the canvas, it's just an example of like, wow, to use an expression, it's in your face.
Yes.
It's like right there, and it's so, I wouldn't say it's unflattering, but it's like clear vision. And
It's one of my favorites.
Yeah, and the way he's looking out at you
Yes.
is also like
It's
unwavering and scrutinizing.
Yes. And George had a little bit of a problem with it. But he's always joking, so I never know how serious it is. But he said,
I was
he
ready.
said, you made my nose as big as an Okanagan mountain. And I looked at it after he commented, and I said, I did. But I said, the problem is that I made this distance right here in your glasses a bit too wide. And then everything else just got wider. And I said, I'd fix it, but it would mean I'd have to change this whole area.
Yeah.
In other words, I can't, it's not an easy fix. It's not like changing the length of your nose and I said, I could do it, but I love this painting so much.
It really is.
I don't really want to touch it because I think I'll lose some quality that it has. And we just left it at
And it'll be days and weeks more working on the face.
No, it's marvelous. It's marvelous. And I know I read I don't know if it's in the book or somewhere where you're talking about how he was joking around a lot. It took a while to even get a photograph of him because he was such a jokester. And but the picture, the portrait is a much more like, he doesn't look like a jokester.
No, he finally kind of settled down and I got some serious, I got some photographs of him looking a bit, not necessarily serious, but not making faces.
Yeah.
And, it was, he had just come back from, I think, his sister's memorial or something in the Okanagan. So almost all his family had died recently, brothers and sisters had died, and he'd been back and forth for funerals and memorials, and I think was feeling, even though he spent his whole career writing things about the town of Oliver, which he calls Lawrence, he was feeling particularly nostalgic about the place and kind of not upset about all the changes that have gone on as the orchards have been taken down and replaced by vineyards, but kind of just sort of wondering if we need that many vineyards.
I wanted to ask you, because my dilemma is almost the opposite of what Charlie was talking about. I've been drawing forever, did paint. I've been focusing on works on paper over the last number of years, and it's mostly pen and ink. And getting a likeness in terms of drawing is not a problem for me. I mean, sometimes I have to do it a few times, but I can get a likeness. But I've also been drawing landscape backgrounds for quite a while, and I've probably drawn about 1,000 mountains in the past 6 months. And it doesn't matter how many times I draw a mountain, every time I sit down to work on a mountain, it's like, it doesn't come easy. I'll just say that. It's not a simple, and it should be, especially a rocky kind of mountain without trees or anything. It should be easy, and it doesn't come, it's not second nature to me.
Well, it's
when
probably...
you're doing landscape, I was going to just ask, when you're doing your landscapes, is there any aspect of it that you are still struggling with? I mean, you know, you've made a zillion brilliant paintings over the years, but is there anything that doesn't come easy to you at this point?
Well, I just ripped up a watercolor today. I don't usually fall completely flat on my face, but I did, because I was trying something that I hadn't ever painted before, and I just didn't have I hadn't developed the vocabulary for doing it.
Right.
Yeah.
And it just, you know, it looked like it was going to work, and then it just went sideways very, very fast. So I think if you're, I think all artists that spend a long time doing landscapes actually spend a long time doing particular landscapes.
Right.
Yeah.
They're you know, or you go out and you look for a piece that works for how you make paintings. You look for a place that looks like one of your paintings.
Right.
And so I can imagine there's tons of stuff that I would not be able to paint, but most of it I don't try.
Not interested, right? So why bother?
Well, yeah, but if all of a sudden something catches my interest, then I've got to go through that kind of very painful process of how do I develop a working vocabulary where the painting looks like my work, and I know how to construct that.
That's actually a good segue into the Douglas Copeland one. Was a mall or something, right? So it was completely must have been an alien landscape for you.
Yeah, it was. I couldn't believe. I thought he was being ironic when he said he wanted me to paint that mall, but it turned out he actually has an attachment to it. It's where his first job was. But yes, I spent forever in that Simon's department store trying to figure out how I was going to paint this, because he also wanted his sculpture in the painting. So it was very, you know, I somehow had to get it in. Yeah. And then figure out what was paintable in the rest. And I just got lucky that they had some mannequins up.
Right.
So I was able to paint the mannequins rather than the whole thing being shirt racks and tie racks. And
right. Yeah. It's very convincing. I mean, you know, just years and years of paint, you know, handling, I guess, comes into play. What's your painting schedule like? You paint every day?
Yeah, I do. Although I've been working on a new body of work which involved a lot more time sketching and looking at stuff this summer.
Right.
And but I work every day. You know, I'm in the studio every day.
Every day, yeah.
And I seem to have a finite number of paintings I can make in a month. And if I do a whole bunch at once, then I don't do anything for a while.
So then you can take a couple days off or whatever.
Well, I never take days off, but I just, you know, I've got to the point where I kind of don't try to push it faster than my kind of best working schedule is.
Right. You just know your own the pace you can go at. So completing the show that's up now with Michael, that must have been kind of intense. I mean,
oh, it was a massive project. I don't think I had any idea when I started it how complex it would be.
What you were getting into.
Yes, and then at the very end, Sarah Milroy had suggested I paint a few more people, which I did.
Right.
Because we were trying to get, like when it's put together as a kind of across Canada project.
Sure.
There are certain kind of balances you have. You can't have like you've got to have somebody from every area. There's got to be a proper mix of men and women and.
Sure, and because you're creating kind of, you know, you're looking at the whatever, like the major leagues of writers. It's like, okay, well, to leave someone out.
Yeah, and well, you know, I did ask more people than the ones who said yes, but it was surprising how many people said yes. I'd say about 75% of the people I approached said
Sure.
Yes, I'm happy to be part of this project.
Right. Were you surprised at people who said no? I mean, I you don't have to say names, but
yeah, there were some, but I always sent them an image of 2 or 3 of the paintings I had done, and I think some people just didn't want me to paint them.
Well, you know, yeah, like this happens with this series we're doing. I've had 3 or 4 people just say no. I'm like, it's the free promotion, and like they don't like to see themselves on the screen, or they don't like the sound of their voice, or.
Yeah, and there's some that are just incredibly shy.
Okay, yeah.
You know, that just don't even like to have their photograph taken.
Right, or even having someone like being in the room, like scrutinizing them.
Yes.
Yeah. We were just talking.
There were just other people for whom I hit them at a time when they're incredibly busy. So I found that if somebody had just won the Giller in the last year, they're probably going to say no, because their schedule was so jammed up that they were just beside themselves looking for a bit of free time. Whereas if they'd won the Giller 4 years ago, and they were no longer had the whole world paying attention, they often said yes.
I was wondering if I could switch perspective for just a moment. Of course, John, you're renowned for your huge, beautiful, large-scale landscapes and cityscapes. But you also, I understand, have a fondness for small accordion book sketchbooks. And I have to say I share a fondness for those. I have my own little collection downstairs that mostly unfinished, a few that may be finished. Can you talk a little bit about that? I know you had one work on your website, The Continuous Landscape, which is beautiful, a beautiful, you know, it's large scale in the sense that it's so these things are long. It's a way of working small scale and large, sort of large at the same time, isn't it? With these accordion.
Yes, and you can also create a narrative, so it
Yes.
can have a beginning and an end.
Yes. There's movement
And
from left to right or right to
yes,
left. Yes.
and so when I started using them, I just started using them because often I worked in a sketchbook format called a Coptic binding that had a binding in the back that allowed you to lay the book flat always.
Yes.
A girl in Newfoundland made them for me, and then at one point she said, you should be using an accordion sketchbook, because what you're doing with mine is you're sitting out in Placentia and you're starting off drawing the landscape you see in front of you, and then you're going, oh, but I'd like to include that over there. And then I would take a page and like fold it like over like this.
Yes.
So then I'd finish the drawing over here. She said, they're really complex books to figure out what you're doing, because you got to flip a page over. She said, if you had the accordion one, you'd just keep going until you run out of landscape. So in the beginning, they would just have 3 or 4 sets of pages, and then there'd be a new image. And then I finally realized I could use the whole thing together. So the very first one I did was the entire shoreline of Georgian Bay with people that lived and worked on it. And then I began looking for similar landscapes that might have a narrative component to them that I could do this with. And then this summer I've been making paintings that kind of record the change in wildlife patterns as the water levels change on Georgian Bay. So as the water level comes up, all these back bays go from being dry to having 5 feet of water in them. And the whole ecology changes, and then all the animals and birds come in and are different. So I've been putting all of these animals and birds in paintings, but I have to figure out how to draw them. And I've been using the accordion sketchbooks for that. And then I just sort of link up one drawing to the next. But they're basically little studies of frogs and turtles and eagles and great blue herons and all these things. Wow. And I just invent the landscape background based on the place where I've seen them. So it sort of ties them all together. But there are a lot of possibilities, but it also creates this discipline of if you want the whole book to link together, it gets incredibly complex the further along you get.
Sure.
And you can just sort of grind yourself to a halt sometimes, because you just can't.
Right.
Like you can't quite figure out how it's going to end.
It's all going to fit together. And
it's like if you're, I work very spontaneously with large drawings, and it's always easy in the beginning because it's carte blanche, and as you get more and more stuff, it's like it's more complicated because you have to figure things out. How are they?
Yeah, because you've got your figures that occupy kind of the frontal plane, but all the interstices between them have to be filled up. And as you go into those, you add more and more detail and further away. And yet it's all what happens over here has to make sense with the background over there. And
totally.
not like, it doesn't have to make logical sense, but it has to make pictorial sense.
Pictorial sense. And at the same time, I mean, there are narrative struggles that also arise, right? I mean, it feels at times almost like creating a storyboard, right? This is going from A to B to C to D, and does D actually fit the plan or the overall arc of the narrative? Or does it work in this? Or should I hold off on D and put D in a different book, or use it in a different place? Are these, have you exhibited them, the accordion books?
I did, the very first one was in a show at Metivier Gallery, and the one I did for the White Museum, where I did a series of paintings that recorded a ski trek that was done in 1967 by 4 guys. That was shown in the White Museum, and they're just shown we just spread them out on a big shelf.
Yes.
Right.
And Nicholas at Metivier Gallery now has the ones from this summer, and I think they'll show I think he has about 4 from the summer, and he'll show one of them probably in a show coming up in November.
Okay, and we're going to look for it.
Yeah. Okay.
Are these published anywhere? Have you published them?
No, I haven't. I mean, it's tempting to try to do it because you could make a reproduction book of it.
Yeah.
Fairly easily. It's just I'm always kind of on to the next thing, and
Sure.
having done the book itself, having filled the sketchbook, I'm off to thinking about something else after I've done that.
Is that painting behind you with the birds part of that series?
Yes.
Yeah, look at that. That is awesome.
Now,
Yeah.
are,
and
you,
the boats,
are you turning realist, John?
Pardon?
Are you turning into a realist now?
Well, yeah, my
Photorealist?
wife
Is
said
that the new?
it's wildlife. My God, what are you doing?
Right. You got the Audubon and Ken Danby to.
Well, I'm actually a great fan of Audubon because he spent a lot of time in the field, and he created these. He killed the birds, so I'm not a fan of that.
Okay.
And to get their skins, which he then stretched and put in what he felt were characteristic poses.
Right.
But they're almost always very unrealistic because he wants to show all the details. So he wants the tail and the wings and the head and the neck and he ends up with them in poses that are kind of great descriptive detail, but kind of weird. And I like that weird element to them.
Sure.
I'm not a huge fan of the way wildlife art went in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. But I think Audubon stuff is quite.
Yeah, I said Ken Danby, but I guess I meant Bateman.
Yes.
Bateman. Yeah. No, so that's the direction you're going in back there with the
But I've also got, you'll see, I've got, kayakers in the sky, and the landscape part, well, you can't see it.
So you've done a few paintings recently with like boaters.
Oh, okay. So we are still our high.
They're in the sky.
Yes.
They're boating in the sky.
Yeah.
In the sky.
Wonderful.
I love that.
And then it's a kind of record of all the animals and birds we saw on 2 trips down this channel that until recently was not navigable. It was dry land.
Okay.
And it's become water again, and it's been very quickly inhabited by, a whole ecology of animals, birds, and things. So I just kind of make a note of everything I saw or my son saw on one of his trips, and then I go about trying to collect images of each of those species, and then figure out how to put them in.
You spend a lot of time in nature, it sounds like.
Well, I have this summer for sure. I mean, I do regularly, but I hadn't been very observant of the different species around until the last couple of years, and then I've started to pay closer attention, and I actually find it really it's quite a wonderful experience just to sit and watch what a bird does when it's feeding, like a heron, like how a heron stands in the water and then just waits and waits and waits and waits, and then a bass swims by. It's about that big, and it just spears it. And then he keeps spearing it, and then he takes it and throws it up in the air and opens his mouth, and it goes first, and then you can see it go down his neck. And then he just sort of stands there very satisfied. And, I mean,
he doesn't even get to savor it at all.
No, they don't care. They don't care.
It's instant. Yeah.
It's like gone straight down.
The accomplishment that they're after.
I wouldn't have known that for sure. Oh man. Well, John, it's been. We should probably let you get back to your painting or whatever you're doing, and it's been Great chatting with you, and
Yes.
yeah.
Well,
And,
thanks,
we're-
guys.
It's
yeah,
a
I
great
can't wait.
honor
Can't wait to see this next. I've seen some.
to chat with you.
I think there are a few paintings you've done recently with boats in the sky, and
Yes.
yeah, I've seen a few of those.
So I've actually been working on this show for 2 years because
Okay.
it was scheduled for last April, and I delivered the whole show basically to Metivier on the 12th of March, and then he closed the gallery that afternoon.
Oh
And
no.
so the
Oh
show,
right.
the show was canceled because of COVID,
Oh,
and we rescheduled it to November. So it actually gave me a chance to keep working on more paintings.
okay, so it's coming up this November?
Yeah.
All right. So we'll great. We'll catch it.
Yeah,
Okay.
we will, for sure.
And if you're at the opening, maybe we'll see you then.
Yes, I'll be
All right.
there.
We'll look for you.
Thanks.
Thank you very much, John. It was
Thank
excellent.
you both, Mark. Thank you, Charles.
Right. Bye for now.